I realized I didn't owe anyone an explanation the night my daughter-in-law corrected me at my own husband's memorial service. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Margaret tends to exaggerate, Olivia said with a polite smile, her hand resting lightly on my son Daniel's arm, as if she were steadying him, as if I were the unstable one. A few people shifted in their seats inside the church fellowship hall. Someone cleared their throat. I felt every pair of eyes move toward me, waiting for my response, waiting for me to clarify what I meant when I said Harold had worked himself to exhaustion providing for this family. For years, I would have rushed to soften my words. I would have smiled and said, "Oh, that's not what I meant," even if it was exactly what I meant. I would have explained myself until everyone felt comfortable again. But that night, standing beside the framed photograph of my husband in his navy suit, I simply folded my hands and said nothing. The silence stretched longer than anyone expected. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator from the church kitchen, the faint clink of silverware from someone setting down a plate of lemon bars. Olivia's smile flickered. Daniel glanced at me, confused, almost irritated, as if I had missed my cue. For 47 years of marriage, I had been the one to smooth things over. I explained why dinner was late. I explained why Daniel couldn't have the newest sneakers when he was 12 because the mortgage had to be paid. I explained why we couldn't co-sign a second loan when he and Olivia bought their first house, even though Harold and I had already helped with the down payment. I explained every boundary as if it were an apology. And somewhere along the way, I began explaining my own feelings as if they required permission. After Harold passed, the house felt too quiet, but not in the way people describe in sympathy cards. It felt observed, judged. Olivia would stand in my kitchen, commenting gently on how much sugar I used in the pecan pie, how outdated my curtains looked, how overwhelming it must be for me to manage a 4-bedroom home alone at 72. Each remark floated in the air like harmless dust, but together they settled into something heavier. Daniel stopped calling without checking. With her first, holiday plans were discussed in group texts I wasn't included in until the details were finalized. And every time I asked a question, every time I expressed disappointment, I felt the familiar pull to justify myself. To prove I wasn't needy. To prove I wasn't dramatic. That evening at the memorial, when Olivia tilted her head and offered her tidy correction, I saw the pattern clearly for the first time. I was expected to defend my memories, my tone, even my grief. I was expected to make everyone else comfortable with the fact that I still existed in the center of my own story. My heart didn't race. My hands didn't shake. Instead, something inside me grew very still. I looked at Harold's photograph, at the soft lines around his eyes that always deepened when he laughed, and I thought about how many times he had told me, "Maggie, you don't have to explain yourself to anyone." I had smiled back then, dismissing it as affection. That night, I understood it as instruction. So I let the silence remain. I did not clarify. I did not shrink. I did not repair the discomfort in the room. And in that small, unremarkable pause, I felt something shift. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply the absence of a burden I had carried for decades. For the first time, I allowed other people to sit with their own assumptions. And I walked out of that hall knowing that if they were unsettled, it was not my job to soothe them anymore. The morning after the memorial, the house felt different. Not emptier but clearer, as if a window had been opened somewhere during the night and the air had shifted. I woke up at 6 as I always did, out of habit more than necessity, and pattered across the hardwood floors Harold had refinished himself 20 years ago. The coffee maker hummed, steady and predictable, and I stood at the kitchen counter watching the sun stretch across the backyard lawn, pale light touching the oak tree where Daniel used to hang a tire swing. My phone buzzed against the granite. Daniel's name lit up the screen. I let it ring twice longer than usual before answering. "Mom," he began, his voice careful. "Olivia did not mean anything by what she said yesterday." I stirred cream into my coffee slowly, watching it cloud and then disappear. In the past, I would have rushed to make it easier for him. I would have said, "Oh, sweetheart, I know, it was my fault. I should have worded it better." I would have carried his discomfort like it was fragile glass. Instead, I said, "I am sure she said exactly what she meant." There was a pause on the other end, a quiet recalibration. "Are you upset?" he asked. I considered the question honestly. I did not feel angry. I felt awake. "No," I said. "I am not upset. And that was true. For years, I had mistaken clarity for conflict. I believed that if I did not explain myself thoroughly, people would assume the worst. I believed love required footnotes. After Harold retired, we spent afternoons on the back porch planning how we would help Daniel build security for his own family. We contributed $30,000 toward the down payment on their house. We paid for 2 semesters of graduate school when the student loans became overwhelming. Each time, I explained that we were happy to do it, that they did not owe us anything, that we understood how hard the economy could be. I explained generosity as if it needed justification. But I began to see how those explanations trained everyone to expect more than support. They expected access. They expected agreement. They expected my silence when I disagreed. Later that afternoon, Olivia sent a text in the family group chat about Thanksgiving plans. She suggested hosting at her house because my place felt a little heavy right now. I read the message twice. Heavy. The word lingered. I could have responded with reassurance, could have offered to redecorate, to make it brighter, to prove that grief did not stain the walls. Instead, I typed, "That sounds fine." No extra sentences. No apology for the atmosphere of my own home. The simplicity felt almost radical. When Daniel called again that evening, his tone was softer, searching. "You seem different," he said. I looked around the kitchen, at the familiar cabinets, at the calendar still flipped to the month Harold passed, and realized he was right. I was different. Not louder. Not colder. Just no longer willing to perform comfort for other people at my own expense. And as the night settled over the house, I understood that silence, when chosen, is not weakness. It is space. And for the first time in a long while, that space belonged entirely to me. I began to notice how quickly the air changes when you stop volunteering explanations. It is subtle at first, like the difference between early fall and late summer. But once you feel it, you cannot ignore it. A week after Thanksgiving plans were settled without my input, Daniel stopped by on a Sunday afternoon. He stood in the doorway of my living room, hands in his jacket pockets, looking around as if he were measuring the space. "Have you thought any more about downsizing?" he asked, his tone careful, almost rehearsed. I folded the blanket on the arm of Harold's old recliner and looked at my son, really looked at him. 45 years old, lines forming at the corners of his eyes, a mortgage that stretched 30 years into the future. I knew that look. It was the same look he had when he was 10 and trying to convince me he needed a new bicycle because everyone else had one. "I am comfortable here," I said. He nodded slowly, waiting for more. In the past, I would have listed reasons. I would have explained that the house was paid off, that the property taxes were manageable, that I liked tending the half-acre of yard because it kept me active. I would have reassured him that I was not lonely, that I was not overwhelmed, that I was capable. This time, I let the sentence stand on its own. "I am comfortable here." The quiet between us lengthened. Daniel cleared his throat. "Olivia just worries," he added. "It is a lot of house for one person." I walked to the window and glanced out at the oak tree, its branches bare now, stretching against a pale winter sky. "It was a lot of house when your father and I were building our life," I said evenly. "We managed." I did not say that we managed without anyone questioning our decisions. I did not say that worry can sometimes disguise preference. Later that evening, I overheard part of a conversation when Daniel stepped onto the porch to take a call. Olivia's voice carried faintly through the screen door. "Did she say anything about the will?" she asked. The word landed heavily, but I did not flinch. I returned to the sink and rinsed my teacup, watching the water spiral down the drain. For years, I had made my intentions clear to everyone, outlining plans, clarifying distributions, explaining fairness as if I were presenting a business proposal. I suddenly understood that transparency had not brought peace. It had invited negotiation. When Daniel came back inside, he avoided my eyes. "Everything okay?" I asked gently. He hesitated, then forced a smile. "Yes, everything is fine." I nodded. I did not ask what Olivia had said. I did not offer reassurance about documents locked in the fireproof box upstairs. For the first time, I allowed information to remain mine. That night, after Daniel left, I sat at the dining room table with a legal pad and wrote down a list of decisions I had postponed out of politeness. Not out of anger. Not out of revenge. Simply out of clarity. I realized that every time I had explained myself in the past, I had been seeking approval. And at 72 years old, Approval felt like an outdated currency. What I wanted now was alignment with my own values. The house creaked softly as the heat turned on, steady and dependable. I looked around at the photographs lining the hallway, at the decades of birthdays and graduations and quiet Tuesday dinners captured in frames, and I felt something steady inside me as well. Not defiance, not bitterness, just resolve. If they were waiting for another explanation, they were going to be waiting a long time. 2 days later, I drove across town to meet with the attorney Harold and I had used for nearly 20 years. The office sat in a modest brick building near the courthouse, the same place where we had signed refinance papers and updated our estate plan when Daniel was in his 20s. The waiting room smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, a scent that felt oddly reassuring. When Mr. Collins stepped out to greet me, his handshake was steady and familiar. "Margaret, it has been a while," he said warmly. I smiled and told him that life has a way of changing faster than we expect. Inside his office, I sat in the same leather chair I had occupied a decade earlier. Back then, Harold had done most of the talking, outlining what he wanted for our family, confident and forward-thinking. I had nodded along, occasionally adding a detail, always explaining our reasoning carefully, as if clarity required defense. This time I spoke first. "I would like to review everything," I said. Mr. Collins opened the thick folder with our names embossed on the tab. He began summarizing the current distribution plan, the percentages allocated, the provisions for Daniel and for our granddaughter. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, he looked up and asked, "What would you like to adjust?" The question hung in the air. Not what does your son think? Not what would make everyone comfortable. Simply what would you like? I folded my hands in my lap and felt the weight of the past year settle into something solid and grounded. "I would like to create a scholarship in Harold's name," I said calmly, "for students at the local trade school." He believed in practical education. Mr. Collins nodded and began taking notes. I continued, my voice even. "I would also like to allocate a portion to the Veterans Community Center, and I want the remainder structured in a trust with specific guidelines." I did not rush through the details. I did not frame them as reactions. I did not mention Olivia's question about the will or Daniel's careful tone. I spoke as a woman making deliberate choices about her own resources. When we finished, Mr. Collins reviewed the changes to ensure accuracy. "Are you comfortable with this?" he asked. I met his eyes. "Yes," I replied. And I was. Driving home, I noticed how steady my hands felt on the steering wheel. The winter sky was pale blue, the kind that promises cold air but clear visibility. At a red light, my phone buzzed again. A message from Olivia this time. She wanted to confirm Christmas plans and asked if I could contribute toward a new living room set they had been considering. I read the message once, then placed the phone face down on the passenger seat. I did not feel anger. I did not feel the urge to justify a no or to soften it with explanation. I felt space. When I arrived home, I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table where Harold and I used to review our monthly expenses down to the last dollar. I picked up my phone and typed a simple response. "I will not be contributing to furniture purchases this year." I added nothing else. No apology. No financial breakdown. No reference to market conditions or retirement budgets. A complete sentence. I set the phone aside and waited for the familiar flicker of guilt. It did not come. Instead, there was a quiet certainty that my choices no longer required approval or explanation. And for the first time, the future felt like something I was shaping rather than defending. Olivia replied within minutes. "That is disappointing," she wrote. "We were counting on your help." I read the message twice, not because I needed clarity, but because I wanted to observe my own reaction. For years, a sentence like that would have tightened my chest. Counting on your help. As if generosity were an obligation with a fixed payment schedule. As if my retirement account were a shared utility. I placed my phone on the kitchen counter and turned back to the sink, where late afternoon light reflected off the stainless steel. I rinsed a plate slowly, listening to the steady rush of water. Disappointing. The word lingered, but it did not pierce. A few minutes later, Daniel called. His voice carried a practiced calm. "Mom, Olivia just feels like you are pulling away," he said. I leaned against the counter and closed my eyes for a moment. "I am not pulling away," I answered. "I am simply choosing where I want to stand." Silence followed. I could almost hear him searching for the correct response, the way he used to search for excuses when he came home past curfew in high school. We just thought you would want to help make things nicer for your granddaughter, he added. There it was. The gentle turn. The moral angle. I pictured my granddaughter coloring at their kitchen table, her small hands smudged with crayon. I loved that child with a depth that surprised me. But love did not require financing sectional sofas. I already help her in ways that matter, I said softly. And I will continue to do so. I did not elaborate. I did not list the college fund I quietly contribute to each month. I did not mention the savings bond tucked into my desk drawer with her name on it. Information is powerful when it is not scattered. Daniel exhaled. You have changed, he said again, this time without accusation. I considered that. Perhaps. I had. Not in my affection, not in my values, but in my tolerance for being managed. After we ended the call, I walked through the house slowly, touching the back of the sofa, the edge of the dining table, the frame of Harold's photograph in the hallway. Every piece held memory. Every room carried effort. 30 years of mortgage payments. Countless Saturday mornings mowing the half-acre of grass under a summer sun. We built this life inch by inch. No one explained our choices to us. No one asked us to justify the shape of our home or the pace of our progress. That evening, as dusk settled outside and the porch light flicked on automatically, I sat down at my desk and opened a small notebook I had not used in months. On the first page, I wrote a simple sentence. I am allowed to decide without defending. I stared at the words for a long moment. They felt unfamiliar and steady at the same time. My phone remained silent on the table beside me. No follow-up message. No further argument. Just quiet. And in that quiet, I noticed something unexpected. The absence of explanation did not create chaos. It created clarity. The world did not collapse because I declined to fund a living room. My son did not disown me. The only thing that shifted was the balance of who carried the emotional weight. For decades, I had lifted it without question. Now, I was setting it down gently, one decision at a time. The following week passed without drama, which in itself felt unfamiliar. No urgent calls. No pointed messages. Just a careful distance, as if everyone were recalculating. I kept my routine steady. I woke at 6, brewed my coffee, and walked the perimeter of the yard even in the cold, my breath visible in the early morning air. The oak tree stood bare and strong, its branches unmoved by winter. I found comfort in that. On Wednesday afternoon, Daniel stopped by unannounced. He used his key, something I had not thought to question before. When he stepped inside, he looked around as though expecting to find something changed. I was in the neighborhood, he said. I nodded and offered him tea. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the same table where I had helped him with math homework. Decades ago, he rested his elbows on the wood and studied me. Olivia feels like you are shutting her out, he began carefully. I stirred honey into my cup and waited. He continued. She is not used to you saying no without explaining why. There it was again. The expectation of explanation, as if clarity required commentary. I set the spoon down gently. I am not shutting anyone out, I said. I am simply answering the question that was asked. Daniel frowned slightly. But do not you think it would help if you told her your reasoning? I considered that. For years, I believed reasoning built bridges. But lately, I had noticed that my explanations often became entry points for negotiation. If I said I was tired, someone suggested a shorter visit. If I said I was budgeting carefully, someone offered a different financial perspective. My reasons were treated like obstacles to be managed rather than boundaries to be respected. My reasoning is private, I said evenly. It does not mean I love you any less. He leaned back in his chair, absorbing the words. The room felt still, not tense, just unfamiliar. For the first time, I could see that my silence unsettled him more than any argument ever had. Without my usual reassurances, he had to confront his own assumptions. You used to talk things through, he said quietly. I smiled, not unkindly. I still do, I replied. Just not every thought needs to be shared. He looked down at his hands, turning his wedding band slightly, a habit he had picked up from his father. I felt a flicker of tenderness, but I did not rush to fill the quiet. After a few moments, he changed the subject, asking about the yard and whether I planned to plant tomatoes again in the spring. We spoke about simple things, about weather patterns and rising grocery prices and the local high school football team. Ordinary conversation. When he stood to leave, he hesitated at the door. I just want things to feel normal, he said. I met his eyes. This is normal, I answered softly. After he drove away, I locked the door and stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the house settle around me. Normal, I realized, had always meant predictable. It had meant that I would smooth every ripple and clarify every pause. But predictability is not the same as peace. As evening fell and the porch light flicked on, I felt the quiet expand gently, not as emptiness, but as space I had finally allowed myself to occupy without apology. December arrived with a quiet kind of tension, the sort that hums beneath ordinary routines. Christmas plans moved forward at Olivia's house, just as she had suggested, and for the first time in years, I was not consulted about the menu, the guest list, or the seating arrangement. A group message outlined the schedule down to the hour. Arrival at 2 o'clock. Dinner at 4. Gift exchange at 6. I read it carefully and responded with a simple, "I will be there at 2. No suggestions. No offers to bring the sweet potato casserole everyone used to expect from me. On Christmas Eve, Daniel called again. His voice was softer than usual. "Mom, Olivia feels like you are distant," he said. I stood at the kitchen counter rolling out sugar cookie dough, the scent of vanilla and butter filling the room. "I am not distant," I replied. "I am present. Just quieter." He exhaled slowly. "She thinks you are upset about the furniture." I smiled faintly, pressing a snowflake cutter into the dough. "People are allowed to think what they want," I said. "I do not have to correct every assumption." There was a pause long enough for both of us to feel it. "It just feels different," he admitted. I placed the cut cookies on a baking sheet, leaving careful space between each one. "Different does not mean wrong," I answered. The next afternoon, I drove to their house with a small tin of cookies and a wrapped book for my granddaughter. The living room did indeed look different. A new sectional sofa in a soft gray fabric curved around a large coffee table. Fresh throw pillows were arranged precisely, as if for a catalog photograph. Olivia greeted me with a bright smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "We managed to make it work," she said lightly, gesturing toward the furniture. I nodded. "It looks nice," I replied, and meant it. Daniel watched us closely, as if bracing for impact. There was none. During dinner, conversation flowed around travel plans, school updates, and rising grocery prices. At one point, Olivia mentioned how challenging it can be when family members are not on the same page financially. The comment hovered in the air. In the past, I would have clarified my position, softened it, explained retirement budgets and fixed incomes and long-term planning. Instead, I took a sip of water and asked my granddaughter about her art project at school. The conversation shifted naturally. No confrontation, no defense, just redirection. Later, while everyone gathered around the tree, my granddaughter climbed into my lap, her small arms wrapping around my shoulders. "Grandma, are you coming over more this year?" she asked. I brushed a strand of hair from her face and smiled. "I will always find time for you," I said. And that was the truth. Love did not require public declarations or financial contributions to prove its depth. As the evening wound down and coats were gathered, Daniel walked me to my car. The cold air carried the scent of pine from the wreath on their door. "You handled today well," he said quietly. I looked at him, noticing the uncertainty behind his eyes. "There was nothing to handle," I replied gently. And as I drove home beneath a sky scattered with winter stars, I realized that the absence of explanation had changed the atmosphere more than any argument ever could. Not because I had won, but because I had stopped competing. January settled in with a sharper kind of cold, the kind that makes the air feel thin and honest. I spent the first week of the new year clearing out the hallway closet, folding coats I had not worn in years, setting aside boxes of old paperwork that no longer served a purpose. There is something steadying about sorting through what you keep and what you release. I found Harold's old work gloves tucked behind a stack of board games and held them for a long moment before placing them in a cedar chest upstairs. Some things are memories. Some things are weight. I was learning the difference. One afternoon, I received an email from the trade school confirming the initial paperwork for the scholarship fund. They attached a draft announcement honoring Harold's years as a master electrician and his belief in practical skills. I read every word slowly, feeling a quiet pride that had nothing to do with recognition and everything to do with alignment. This decision felt clean. No debate. No family meeting. Just a choice. Made from conviction. That evening, Daniel called again, but his tone was different this time. Less cautious. More direct. "Mom, Olivia heard from someone at church that you were setting up a scholarship, he said. I leaned back in my armchair, the soft lamp light pooling around me. Yes, I answered simply. He hesitated. Why did not you tell us? I considered the question carefully. Because it is not something that required discussion, I replied. The silence that followed was not tense, just unfamiliar. We just want to understand what you are planning, he said. I heard the underlying concern, the unspoken calculation about what these plans might mean for them. For years, I would have reassured him with detailed outlines and projected numbers. I would have explained how nothing would change for his family. This time, I chose precision instead of volume. I am planning to use my resources in ways that reflect my values, I said calmly. That is all. He exhaled slowly. It feels like you are making big decisions alone. I smiled faintly, though he could not see it. I am, I said. There was no edge in my voice. Just truth. After we ended the call, I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator. I stood there for a moment, reflecting on how foreign independence can feel to those who have grown accustomed to access. It was never about the money. It was about expectation, about who had the right to question and who felt obligated to answer. A few days later, Olivia sent a short message asking if we could meet for coffee, just the two of us. In the past, that invitation would have filled me with anxiety. I would have rehearsed explanations in my head, prepared justifications, softened my posture before even stepping into the cafe. This time, I simply replied, that works for me. Let me know the time. No preamble. No defense. As I set my phone down, I noticed something steady in my chest. Not defiance. Not anticipation. Just readiness. I was no longer afraid of the silence between questions and answers. I had learned that sometimes the strongest response is not what you say, but what you choose not to explain. The cafe Olivia chose was a bright corner place downtown with wide windows and pale wooden tables, the kind of space designed to feel open and neutral. I arrived 5 minutes early and ordered hot tea, choosing a seat where I could see the door. When she walked in, she wore a tailored coat and that familiar composed expression, the one that suggested she had rehearsed this conversation in advance. She sat across from me, smoothing her sleeve before speaking. I feel like there is distance between us, she began, her voice even but measured. I wrapped both hands around my cup and let the warmth settle into my palms. Distance can mean many things, I said calmly. She paused, clearly expecting more. When none came, she continued. You used to talk things through. Now you just make decisions and inform us afterward. I studied her face, noticing the faint tension at the corners of her mouth. For years, I had mistaken her need for input as a desire for harmony. Now I recognized it as something else. I am not required to process every decision out loud, I replied, especially when it concerns my own life. She shifted slightly in her chair. It makes us feel excluded. The word lingered between us. Excluded. I thought about the holidays planned without my input, the financial discussions conducted in whispers, the subtle suggestions about downsizing. I did not list them. I did not counter with examples. I am not excluding anyone, I said gently. I am simply living independently. She held my gaze for a long moment. We just want to understand where we stand. There it was again. The desire for reassurance. The request for clarity shaped like concern. I took a slow sip of tea before answering. You stand where you have always stood, I said. As my family. But my choices are mine. The simplicity of it seemed to unsettle her more than any argument would have. She leaned back, folding her arms lightly. So that is it, she asked. I considered the question. Yes, I said. No defense. No elaboration. The conversation shifted after that. We spoke about my granddaughter's upcoming school play and the new art teacher she adored. We discussed the unusually cold winter and the rising cost of heating bills. Ordinary topics. When we stood to leave, Olivia hesitated near the door. I did not mean to make you feel small, she said quietly. It was the closest she had come to acknowledgement. I met her eyes and nodded once. I know, I replied. Whether that was entirely true did not matter. What mattered was that I no longer needed her to validate my experience. Outside, the air was crisp and bright. I walked to my car feeling steady, not triumphant, not wounded, just aligned. Later that evening, I sat in my living room with the lights dimmed, the quiet wrapping around me like a familiar blanket. I looked at the oak tree through the front window, its branches beginning to show the faintest signs of early buds despite the cold. Change does not announce itself loudly. It happens gradually, almost invisibly, until one day you realize the landscape is different. I had spent decades explaining my intentions, smoothing every ripple, ensuring that everyone else felt secure. Now I understood that peace does not come from constant clarification. It comes from knowing that your worth does not depend on being understood. And in that understanding, I felt something simple and steady take root. Not rebellion, not distance, just freedom shaped by quiet certainty.